My name is Quentin. I'm 42, and I stood in the living room where Dad used to read his Sunday paper, the quiet, heavier than ever. His funeral was last week, and already Mom was pacing, her voice sharp, saying the house was hers now. Grandma, her hands trembling, didn't argue. Her face went pale, and she packed a single bag, leaving without a word. Days later, she came back with Dad's lawyer papers in his hand, his eyes steady. What had Dad kept from me? If you've ever felt a truth unravel, stay with me. The house smelled of stale coffee and dust, the kind that settles when nobody cares to sweep. I wandered through it, my boots scuffing the hardwood Dad used to polish. Mom was in the kitchen, her back to me, sorting silverware like it was a battle plan. She'd already moved Dad's old armchair to the garage, its leather cracked but still holding his shape. I didn't say anything, just watched her stack his books into cardboard boxes, their spines creased from his hands. It felt like she was boxing him up too, like the funeral hadn't been enough to erase him. I wanted to ask why, but my throat tightened, the words stuck like damp paper. I drifted to Dad's study, a room Mom avoided. His desk sat heavy with papers, receipts, a half-empty bottle of bourbon. I ran my fingers over the wood, feeling the grooves where he'd carved his initials as a kid. Under a stack of bills, I found a letter, the envelope yellowed, addressed to Grandma in his slanted handwriting. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen his writing since he'd scrawled my birthday card last year. The letter was sealed, but the word promise was visible through the thin paper, underlined twice. I held it, my pulse loud in my ears, wondering what he'd promised and why he hadn't told me. I carried the letter to the kitchen, where Mom was now wiping counters with a rag, her movements sharp. I set the envelope down, the sound soft but heavy. She glanced at it, then at me, her eyes narrowing. "What's that, Quentin?" she asked. Her voice clipped like I'd caught her off guard. "Found it in Dad's desk," I said, my tone flat though my stomach churned. "It's for Grandma. Says something about a promise." She stopped, wiping her hand, hovering over the counter. For a second, I thought I saw her flinch, but then she laughed, a short, brittle sound. "You're reading too much into it. Your father wrote a lot of things. He was sick, Quentin. His head wasn't always clear." She turned back to the counter, scrubbing harder. I stood there, the letter in my hand, her words sinking in. She was dismissing him, dismissing me. I wanted to push, to demand what she knew, but the weight of the past week pressed down. The funeral, the casseroles from neighbors, the way everyone looked at me like I was supposed to have answers. I didn't. I just had this letter, and it felt like a lifeline I didn't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked, each sound a reminder of Dad's absence. I lay in my old bedroom, the one I'd moved back into after the funeral, staring at the ceiling. Downstairs, I heard Mom's voice, low and urgent, on the phone. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold on the floor, and crept to the top of the stairs. Her words were muffled, but I caught enough. "We can list it next month," she said. "It's a good market. We'll get top dollar." My breath caught. Selling the house. She hadn't said a word to me. I leaned against the wall, the letter still in my pocket, its edges sharp against my leg. Dad's house, the one he'd rebuilt after the flood, the one where he taught me to throw a curveball in the backyard. She was planning to let it go, like it was just brick and wood. I wanted to storm down, demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way she'd laughed earlier, like I was a kid who didn't get it. Maybe it was the fear that if I pushed, I'd lose her too. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, Mom's voice still echoing in my head. The house was silent. Now, her call ended, but the words about selling it clung to me like damp clothes. I slipped back to my room, the letter still in my pocket, its weight heavier than before. I didn't open it. Not yet. It felt like a door I wasn't ready to step through, like whatever was inside might change everything. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped, staring at the floorboards Dad had sanded smooth when I was a kid. Morning came gray and heavy with clouds. I found Mom in the dining room, paper spread across the table, her coffee mug leaving rings on the wood. She didn't look up as I walked in, just kept scribbling notes. I noticed a real estate flyer among the mess, glossy with a photo of a house not unlike ours. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" I said, leaning against the doorframe. She set her pen down, slow, deliberate. "Quentin, this place is too big for me alone. It's practical. You've got your own life." Her tone was calm, like she was explaining math to a child. I wanted to snap back, tell her it wasn't just a house, but the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't guilt or sadness, just certainty, like she'd already moved on. I felt small, like I was intruding in her plans. "And Grandma?" I asked, my voice lower than I meant. "What about her mom's side?" Pushing her hair back. "She's got her apartment. She'll be fine. You worry too much." She stood gathering her papers and brushed past me to the kitchen. The dismissal stung sharper than I expected. I was 42, but in that moment, I felt like a kid again, unheard. I went outside needing air. The backyard was overgrown, the grass patchy, where Dad used to mow in neat lines. I walked to the edge of the property, where the fence sagged under years of neglect. That's when Selma the neighbor appeared, her garden shears in hand. She was older, maybe 70, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Saw your mom with a realtor yesterday," she said, clipping a rose bush. "Didn't expect that so soon after your dad." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Selma paused, her shears still. "You know, Quentin, I saw your dad and your grandma out here a few months back. They were arguing, heated. Never heard him raise his voice like that before." She looked at me, waiting like she knew more, but wouldn't say. "What were they fighting about?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She shrugged, turning back to her roses. "Couldn't hear. Just saw your dad point at the house, then walk away." Your grandma looked shaken. She clipped another stem, the sound sharp in the quiet. I stood there, the letter burning a hole in my pocket. An argument Dad never fought with anyone, least of all Grandma. I thought of the word promise in his handwriting, the way it felt like a secret meant for someone else. I wanted to press Selma, but she was already back to her gardening, humming softly. I walked back inside the air cooler now, the sky threatening rain. Mom was gone, her car not in the driveway. I sat at the dining table, the real estate flyer staring up at me. My fingers traced the edges of the letter still unopened. I could tear it open now, read what Dad had written, but something held me back. Fear, maybe, that it would confirm Mom was right, that Dad's mind was slipping at the end. Or worse, that he trusted Grandma with something he didn't trust me with. The thought twisted in my gut, cold and heavy. I tucked the letter into my jacket, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. I needed to see Grandma, to ask her what she knew before Mom's plans went any further. I drove to the diner where Grandma asked to meet, the letter still in my jacket, its edges worn from my fingers. The sky was heavy rain spitting against the windshield. Inside, the place smelled of grease and burnt coffee, the kind of spot Dad would have liked. Grandma sat in a corner booth, her hands folded around a mug, her face lined but sharp. I slid in across from her, my stomach knotted, not sure what I was chasing. She looked up, her eyes steady, like she'd been waiting for this longer than I knew. "You found something, didn't you?" she said, her voice low, not accusing, just certain. I nodded, pulling the letter out but keeping it on the table unopened. "It's got your name on it. Says promise." What didn't he tell me? My words came out harder than I meant, frustration leaking through. She didn't flinch, just sipped her coffee slow. "Your father had a will, Quentin. Not the one your mom's leaning on, a newer one. He wrote it last year when he knew he was sick." She paused, her fingers tightening on the mug. "He trusted me to make sure it was followed." My chest tightened like the air was thinning. A will. Mom hadn't said a word about it, just barreled ahead with her plans to sell. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost a whisper. The diner's hum faded, the clink of dishes distant. Grandma's eyes softened, but she didn't look away. "He wanted to protect you. Thought you had enough on your plate. But he made me swear to fix this if your mom tried to take the house." Her words landed heavy, each one a stone in my gut. Dad had planned for this, seen it coming, and I'd been blind. I leaned back, the vinyl booth creaking. "She's already got a realtor," I said, my hands clenching under the table. "Some woman named Doreen was at the house yesterday, talking about curb appeal and market value." The memory of Doreen's clipboard, her fake smile, made my jaw tight. Mom hadn't even blinked, just nodded along like it was already decided. Grandma's face didn't change, but her knuckles whitened. "That's why I'm here. Your father knew she'd try to take control. She's done it before." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge, something old and buried. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped me. It was the same look she'd had when she packed her bag and left. Back at the house, I found Mom in the living room, showing Doreen the fireplace, pointing out its stonework like it was a selling point. The sight of them, casual and businesslike, twisted something in me. I stood in the doorway, my hands in my pockets, the letter still there, a secret I wasn't ready to show. Doreen glanced at me, her smile too bright. "You must be Quentin. This place has so much potential. We're thinking spring listing." I didn't answer, just looked at Mom. She met my eyes, her expression unreadable, then turned back to Doreen. "Let's check the upstairs," she said, leading her away. I stayed rooted, my pulse loud in my ears, feeling like a guest in my own home. The letter felt heavier now, like it held more than words, maybe the truth Dad had hidden. I stepped outside to clear my head, the air damp and cool. That's when I saw Clarence Mom's new boyfriend in the backyard. He was pacing near the shed, a tape measure in his hand, sizing up the ground like he owned it. He was older, maybe 50-ish, with a slick way of talking that never sat right with me. I watched him for a moment, my hands balling into fists. He hadn't been around when Dad was alive, but now he was here, measuring my father's land. I wanted to confront him, demand what he was doing, but the weight of Grandma's words held me back. A will, a promise, something Mom was hiding. I turned away my boots, sinking into the wet grass, knowing I couldn't stay silent much longer. I stood in the backyard, the damp air clinging to my skin, watching Clarence stretch his tape measure along the fence line. His movements were precise, like he was claiming the ground inch by inch. I wanted to shout, to tell him to get off Dad's land, but my feet stayed planted heavy as stone. The letter in my pocket felt like a live wire, its secrets buzzing against my ribs. I turned back to the house, my throat tight knowing I couldn't face him yet. Inside, Mom and Doreen were gone, the living room empty except for the faint scent of her perfume. I wandered to the kitchen, where a stack of real estate flyers sat on the counter, each one glossy and cold, promising a future that didn't include me. I picked one up, the paper slick under my fingers, and saw a note scrawled in Mom's handwriting, "Clear out garage by Friday." The garage, where Dad's armchair now sat, banished like it didn't belong. My chest ached, a dull pressure that wouldn't ease. She was moving faster than I'd realized, erasing him piece by piece. I sank into a chair, the letter still untouched in my jacket. Grandma's words at the diner echoed. Dad had seen this coming. He'd known Mom would try to take control, but he hadn't warned me. Why? Had he thought I couldn't handle it? The thought gnawed at me, sharp and cold, like I'd failed him before he was even gone. I stared at the flyer, its bright photo of a stranger's house mocking me. This was real. She was selling, and I was just standing here watching it happen. The doorbell rang, jarring me. It was Selma again, her coat damp from the drizzle. She held a tin of cookies, her excuse for stopping by. "Thought you could use these," she said, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for something. I took the tin, my hands clumsy, and mumbled a thanks. She lingered, her gaze settling on the flyers. "Your mom's in a hurry, isn't she?" Her tone was light, but there was a weight behind it, like she knew more than she was saying. "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "She's got plans." I didn't want to talk, didn't want her pity. But Selma stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You know, Quentin, your dad was out here a lot those last months. Always checking that shed. I thought it was odd, him locking it up tight like that." She paused, waiting for me to react, but I just nodded, my mind racing. The shed. Clarence had been circling it. What was in there that Dad cared so much about? Selma left, and I stood alone, the tin cold in my hands. I walked to the window, looking out at the shed, its padlock glinting faintly in the rain. My fingers brushed the letter again, and I almost tore it open, desperate for answers. But something stopped me. Fear, maybe, that it would confirm I'd been left out of Dad's plans for a reason. I shoved it deeper into my pocket, my hands shaking. That evening, Mom came home with Clarence, their voices loud as they entered. I stayed in the kitchen, out of sight, listening. Clarence was talking about the backyard, saying it could fit a pool boost, the sale price. Mom laughed, agreeing, her voice lighter than I'd heard in weeks. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, feeling like an outsider in my own home. I wanted to storm in demand to know about the will Grandma mentioned, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there silent, the weight of their plans pressing down. I slipped upstairs, avoiding them, and locked my bedroom door. The letter sat on my nightstand, now its edges curling slightly. I stared at it, my heart pounding, knowing I had to confront Mom soon. But not yet. Not tonight. The house creaked around me, and outside the rain fell harder, drumming against the roof. I lay down, eyes open, wondering if Dad had known how alone I'd feel in this fight. The rain had stopped, leaving the house damp and quiet, like it was holding its breath. I sat in the kitchen, the letter from Dad on the table, still unopened. I'd carried it for days, its weight a constant pull, but I couldn't bring myself to read it. Not yet. The front door creaked open, and I heard Grandma's slow steps, followed by another set, heavier, deliberate. I stood, my pulse quickening, as she entered with a man I vaguely recognized. Bernard, Dad's lawyer, carried a briefcase, his face calm but unyielding. Grandma didn't sit, just stood by the counter, her hands clasped tight. "Quentin," she said, her voice steady, "Bernard has something you need to see." Her eyes held mine, not soft, but urgent, like she was passing me something heavy. Bernard set his briefcase on the table, snapping it open with a sound that cut the silence. He pulled out a document, thick, stapled, and placed it in front of me. "This is your father's will," he said, his voice even, like he was reading a weather report. "Dated last April, signed and witnessed." He tapped the paper, pointing to Dad's signature, unmistakable, looping across the bottom. I stared at it, my throat dry. The words blurred, but one line stood out. The house, Dad's house, was left to me. Not Mom. Me. My hands shook, and I pressed them flat against the table to stop it. "This can't be right," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper. "Mom said she owned it. She's selling it." Bernard didn't blink. "Your mother's working off an older will from before you were born. This one supersedes it. Your father was clear. The house is yours, Quentin." He slid another paper forward, a notarized letter detailing Dad's intent. It was his handwriting again, precise, like he'd thought every word through. Grandma spoke, her voice softer now. He didn't want her to know until it was time. He knew she'd fight it. Her words landed like a slow blade cutting through the fog I'd been living in. Dad had planned this, kept it from Mom, from me. I felt a rush of heat, not anger exactly, but something close, like I'd been betrayed by his silence. The back door opened, and Mom walked in, her coat still on keys, jangling in her hand. She stopped, her eyes flicking from me to Bernard to the papers. "What's this?" she asked, her tone sharp, like she already knew. Bernard stood straighter. "It's your husband's will, Dolores. The house belongs to Quentin." He held up the document, his voice calm but firm, like he was used to delivering bad news. Mom's face changed, not pale, like Grandma's had been, but hard, her lips a thin line. "That's nonsense," she said, stepping forward, her voice rising. He was sick. He didn't know what he was signing. "This is fake." She snatched the will, her fingers trembling as she scanned it, her breath coming fast. I stood my chair, scraping the floor. "It's his signature, Mom," I said, my voice steady but cracking at the edges. "I know it. You know it." My heart pounded each beat loud in my ears. I wanted her to deny it again, to give me a reason to push back. But I also wanted her to stop, to explain why she'd hidden this. She threw the papers down her eyes, blazing. "You're going to believe this over me after everything." Her voice was loud now, filling the room, and I felt it press against me like a wall. I couldn't push through. Grandma stepped forward, her hand on my arm, light but firm, grounding me. "Dolores," she said, her voice quiet but cutting, "he made his choice. You don't get to undo it." Mom turned on her, her face twisting. "You stay out of this, Thelma. You've always meddled." She grabbed her keys and stormed toward the door, her footsteps echoing. The door slammed, and the house fell silent again, heavier than before. I stared at the will, Dad's words staring back, and felt something inside me crack like ice, giving way under too much weight. The silence after Mom's exit was thick, like the air before a storm breaks. I stood there, the will still on the table, its pages slightly curled from her grip. Bernard closed his briefcase, the snap loud in the quiet, and looked at me with a nod, like he'd done his job, and now it was mine. Grandma stayed by the counter, her hands still clasped, her eyes on me, waiting. I wanted to speak, to ask why Dad hadn't trusted me with this, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the weight of what I'd just seen. I sat down, my legs heavy, and picked up the will again. The words were clear now. The house, the land, everything Dad had poured his life into was mine. But it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a burden, a secret he'd kept from me, maybe because he thought I wasn't strong enough to carry it. My fingers traced his signature, and I saw him in my mind sitting at his desk, pen in hand, planning this without a word to me. The thought stung sharp and cold, like a blade I didn't see coming. Grandma moved closer, her steps slow, and sat across from me. "Quentin," she said, her voice low, "I should have told you sooner. I promised him I'd wait, let him handle it his way. But he ran out of time." Her words were soft, but they cut deeper than Mom's anger. She'd known. All this time she'd carried this too, and I'd been blind, thinking she was just grieving like me. I looked at her, my throat tight. "Why didn't you say anything? You saw her packing up his things, talking about selling." "You let me think." I stopped, my voice breaking not from tears, but from something heavier, like the air was pressing me down. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was hollow, like the house itself stripped of Dad's presence. Grandma's face softened, but her eyes were steady. "I thought I was protecting you. Your father didn't want you caught in the middle. He said you'd been through enough." Her words landed like stones, each one sinking me deeper. Enough. What had I been through that made him hide this? I thought of the years I'd spent away working long hours, calling Dad on weekends, never knowing he was planning for a fight I didn't see coming. The front door opened again, and I tensed, expecting Mom. But it was Clarence, his jacket damp, his face set in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't look at Grandma or Bernard, just at me, his eyes narrow. "So you're the big man now, huh?" he said, his voice low, almost a sneer. "Think you can just take what's hers?" He stepped closer, his boots loud on the floor, and I felt my hands clench, but I didn't move. Bernard stood, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the time, Clarence. The will is legal. It's done." He held up a hand like he was stopping traffic, but Clarence ignored him, his gaze locked on me. "You don't even want this place," Clarence said, leaning in, his breath sour. You're never here. Let her have it. She deserves it more than you. His words hit like a punch, not because they were true, but because they echoed the doubt I'd been carrying. Did I deserve it? Had Dad been wrong to trust me? I stood my chair scraping, but I didn't speak. My heart was pounding my chest tight, but I couldn't find the words. Clarence smirked like he'd won something and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. The cold air rushed in, chilling the room, and I felt it settle in my bones. Grandma reached for my hand, but I pulled back, not ready for her comfort. I looked at the will, its pages stark against the table, and felt the world I'd known crack open, leaving me standing in the empty space where trust used to be. I woke to the sound of birds outside their calls, sharp in the early light. The will sat on my nightstand, its pages creased from where I'd held it too tight. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. Dad's choice was clear, and for the first time I felt it settle in me, not as a burden, but as a line I wouldn't cross. I got up dressed in an old flannel of his and went downstairs. The house was quiet, Mom still gone, the air stale with her absence. I called Bernard, my voice steady as I asked him to meet me. He arrived within the hour, his briefcase in hand, his face as calm as before. We sat in the dining room, the table bare, now no flyers or coffee rings. Tell me what Dad wanted, I said, my hands folded, my eyes on his. Not just the legal stuff, what he meant by this. Bernard leaned back, his fingers tapping the briefcase. Your father saw this house as more than property. It was his anchor, something to keep you grounded. He knew you'd need it after he was gone. His words were plain, but they hit hard like a truth I'd always known but never named. I nodded, my jaw tight, feeling Dad's presence in the room, in the walls he'd built. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard. The shed stood there, its padlock glinting in the sun. Clarence's tape measure had been left on the grass, a careless claim on what wasn't his. I turned back to Bernard. I'm keeping the house, I said, my voice low but firm. Mom can stay if she wants, but it's not hers to sell. Bernard nodded, pulling out a notepad. I'll draft a letter to your mother formalizing your intent. She'll need to acknowledge the will. He paused, his pen still. She won't like it, Quentin. Be ready for that. I didn't answer, just looked out at the shed again, my mind already moving to the next step. After Bernard left, I went to the garage where Dad's armchair still sat pushed against a wall like forgotten junk. I dragged it back inside, setting it in the living room where it belonged. The leather creaked under my hands, and I could almost smell his aftershave faint, but there, I sat in it, my fingers tracing the armrests, and felt a quiet strength, like Dad was still guiding me. The phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Grandma, her voice thin but clear. I'm coming back today, she said. I want to be there when you talk to her. I agreed, grateful for her presence, even if it came with its own weight. I hung up and walked to the shed, the key I'd found in Dad's desk, cold in my pocket. I hadn't opened it yet, hadn't wanted to face what it held, but now I needed to know. The lock clicked open, the sound sharp in the still air, and I pushed the door, its hinges groaning. Inside it was dark, the air thick with dust, but I could see boxes, tools, and something else, a shape I couldn't make out yet. I stepped inside, my heart steady but loud. ready to face whatever Dad had left behind. The shed smelled of rust and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to memory. I stood just inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. Stacks of boxes lined one wall. Dad's tools hung neatly on another, their handles worn smooth from his grip. In the corner, a tarp covered something bulky, its edges frayed. I pulled it back, revealing an old workbench scarred from years of use, with a small locked box on top. My breath caught. This wasn't junk, it was Dad's deliberate hidden. I slid the key from my pocket, the one I'd found in his desk, and opened the box. Inside was a stack of photos me as a kid, Dad teaching me to hammer nails, both of us grinning in the sun. Beneath them, a note in his handwriting, "For Quentin. Keep it yours." My chest tightened, not with pain but with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. He'd meant this for me, not just the house, but what it stood for. Something solid, something mine. I locked the shed behind me and walked to the porch, the photos tucked inside my jacket. The air was crisp, the sky clearing to a pale blue. I heard a car pull up and saw Grandma step out, her suitcase, small but heavy, in her hand. She didn't smile, just nodded like she knew I'd found what I needed. "You ready to talk to her?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes searching mine. I nodded, my jaw tight. "Yeah, but it's my call now." The words felt new, like I was speaking them for the first time. Grandma's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough. She walked inside, leaving me to finish what I'd started. Mom's car rolled into the driveway an hour later, Clarence beside her. I met them at the door, my hands steady, the photos a quiet weight against my chest. Mom's eyes were sharp, like she was bracing for a fight. "What's this about Quentin?" she asked, her voice clipped, already defensive. I didn't flinch. "You can live here," I said, my tone even, "but the house stays mine. Dad's will is clear. I'm not selling." The words came out clean, no hesitation, like I'd been practicing them my whole life. Clarence stepped forward, his shoulders squared, but I held his gaze unflinching. "Don't measure the yard again," I said, my voice low, final. "It's not yours to touch." Mom's face tightened, her lips parting, like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Clarence muttered something under his breath and walked back to the car. Mom stayed, her eyes locked on mine, searching for a crack. I didn't give her one. She turned and followed him, her steps slow, like she was carrying something heavier than I could see. I went to the porch, the wood creaking under my boots. I pulled out a hammer from Dad's toolbox, one I'd found in the shed, its handle fitting my palm like it was made for me. I started prying up a loose board, the nails squeaking as they came free. Each swing was deliberate, not angry, just sure. The house wasn't just walls, it was Dad's trust, and I wasn't letting it go. I drove a new nail in, the sound sharp and final, a promise I'd keep. The porch board was secure now, the new nail flush with the wood. I set the hammer down, its weight grounding me, and wiped the sweat from my brow. The house felt different, like it was breathing again, but the quiet was heavier than before. Mom hadn't come back since I'd laid down the line, and Clarence's car hadn't returned either. I stood looking out at the yard, the grass still holding the shape of his tape measure. Grandma was inside, unpacking her suitcase. Her movements slow, but deliberate, like she was staking her own claim. I went to the shed again, needing to see what else Dad had left. The workbench was still there, the photos I'd found tucked back in their box. I lifted it heavier than it looked and found a journal underneath its leather cover, worn soft. I opened it, my fingers careful, and saw Dad's handwriting tight and precise, detailing repairs he'd planned for the house. New roof, better insulation, a garden for me to tend. Each entry was dated, the last one just weeks before he died. My throat tightened, not from grief, but from the realization he'd been building a future I hadn't seen. The phone rang, pulling me back. It was Bernard, his voice clipped professional. "Your mother's lawyer called. She's contesting the will, says it was signed under duress." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It'll cost you to fight this, Quentin. Legal fees, maybe months of back and forth. You sure you want to go down this road?" I gripped the phone, my knuckles pale. I'm sure I said, my voice low but steady. "Dad meant this for me. I'm not letting it go." Bernard didn't argue, just said he'd start the paperwork. I hung up the journal, still open in front of me, Dad's plans staring up like a challenge I hadn't asked for. Grandma came out, her sweater loose on her frame. She didn't ask about the call, just sat on the porch steps, her hands folded. "Your mother left a note," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "Found it in the mailbox this morning." She handed it to me, her eyes careful, like she knew what it held. I unfolded it, the paper, thin and creased. Mom's handwriting was sharp, rushed. "You've chosen a house over family, Quentin. Don't expect me to stay." The words cut, not because they were loud, but because they were final, like a door she'd already closed. I folded the note, my hand steady, but inside, something twisted, a quiet ache I didn't want to name. I looked at Grandma, her face unreadable. "She's wrong," I said, more to myself than her. "This isn't just a house." Grandma nodded, her silence louder than words, and went back inside. I stayed on the porch, the note in my hand, the journal at my feet. The cost was already mounting money. I didn't have a mother I might lose, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. The air was still, the yard empty, and I stood there, caught in the pause before everything changed. I stood on the porch, Mom's note still in my hand, its edges soft from my grip. The yard was quiet, the grass damp from last night's rain, and the shed stood like a sentinel at the edge. I tucked the note into my pocket next to the photos from Dad's box and went inside. Grandma was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, the steam curling up in the dim light. She didn't look at me, just kept stirring, her movements slow, like she was carrying something heavier than the spoon. I sat at the table, the journal open to a page where Dad had sketched a new fence, his lines careful, almost tender. I traced them with my finger, feeling the indentations, and wondered how much he'd known about Huey, Mom's plans. The legal fees Bernard mentioned loomed in my mind, a number I couldn't quite grasp, draining what little I'd saved. The house needed work too, leaky pipes, a sagging roof, each repair $1. I didn't have. I leaned back my chair, creaking, and felt the weight of it all settle, not crushing, but constant. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden. I opened it to find Marjorie, my old friend, standing there with a toolbox, her hair tied back, her eyes cautious but warm. Thought you might need a hand, she said, lifting the toolbox slightly. Heard about the house. Her voice was soft, but it carried an edge like she knew more than she was saying. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Thanks, I said, my voice flat, not sure how to bridge the gap between us. We'd been close once before I moved away before Dad got sick. Now she was here, and I wasn't sure what I felt. She set the toolbox down, glancing at the journal on the table. Your dad's? She asked, her fingers brushing the page. Yeah, I said, my throat tight. He had plans. I didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, just nodded and started unpacking tools. We worked in silence, tightening a loose cabinet door, the clink of screws, the only sound. I wanted to tell her about Mom's note about the will, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I focused on the task, my hands moving automatically, like Dad's had. Grandma brought us soup, her steps slower than before. She set the bowls down, her eyes lingering on me. Your mother called, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's staying with Clarence. Says she won't come back until you change your mind. Her words were simple, but they landed like a stone in still water rippling out. I nodded my spoon, still unable to meet her gaze. Marjorie glanced at me, her hands pausing on a screwdriver. You okay? She asked, her tone careful, like she was testing the ground. I shrugged my jaw tight and went back to the cabinet. I wanted her help, her presence, but I couldn't let her in, not yet. The space between us felt wider than it should, filled with things I couldn't say. Later, alone in the living room, I found a letter from Mom on the coffee table, different from the note. It was longer, her handwriting less rushed, asking to meet to talk. I read it twice, my fingers cold, and set it down. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I stood by the window watching the street. A car passed, its headlights cutting through the dusk, and I felt the emptiness of Mom's absence. The cost of my choice settled like dust I couldn't sweep away. I woke to the sound of rain, soft against the roof, the kind that doesn't demand attention but settles in anyway. The house was still, the air cool, carrying the faint smell of paint from yesterday's work. I'd started on the hallway, covering the faded beige with a color Dad had picked out years ago. A pale gray, he said, felt like morning. Each stroke of the roller was steady, my hands moving like they knew the job better than I did. It wasn't just fixing walls, it was reclaiming something piece by piece. Grandma was in the living room, knitting her needles, clicking in a rhythm that filled the quiet. She'd been stronger lately, her cough less frequent, her eyes sharper. I sat across from her, a mug of coffee cooling in my hands, and watched her work. The yarn was green, like the grass Dad used to mow. He loved this place, she said, not looking up. Used to sit out back, just listening to the birds. I nodded, my throat tight. I saw him in my mind, leaning back in a lawn chair, his cap tilted low, a beer in his hand. I hadn't thought of that in years, but it came back clear, like the rain had washed the haze away. He ever talk about me? I asked, my voice low, almost lost in the clicking of her needles. She paused, her hands still, and looked at me. All the time. Said you were stubborn like him. Said you'd find your way. Her words were plain, but they carried a weight like she was handing me something fragile. I looked down at my coffee, the steam gone, and felt a shift inside. Not loud, just steady, like I was starting to see myself through Dad's eyes. I spent the afternoon in the backyard, clearing weeds from the garden bed Dad had sketched in his journal. The soil was damp, clinging to my gloves, and I worked slow pulling roots one by one. Marjorie showed up unannounced, her boots muddy, a shovel in hand. "Figured you could use help," she said, her voice light but careful, like she wasn't sure she was welcome. I nodded, grateful, and we worked side by side, the only sound the scrape of metal on dirt. When we finished, the bed was clear, ready for planting. Marjorie wiped her hands, her cheeks red from the cold. "You're different," she said, squinting at me. "Not sure what it is, but you're not the same guy I knew." She didn't wait for an answer, just picked up her shovel and left her words lingering like the rain. I stood by the garden, my hands still, the air heavy with the scent of turned earth. I thought of Mom's letter, still unanswered on the table, and the way she'd looked at me before she left. I wasn't ready to face her, not yet. The house felt alive again, but it carried a quiet ache like a bruise I could live with but wouldn't ignore. I leaned against the fence, my breath slow, and let the moment hold me steady and still. The rain had stopped, leaving the yard soft underfoot, the air clean with the smell of wet leaves. I walked to the shed, my boots sinking slightly in the mud, and opened the door. Inside, Dad's tools gleamed faintly, untouched since I'd found the photos. I picked up a screwdriver, its handle smooth from his grip, and turned it over in my hands. It wasn't just a tool, it was his way of teaching me to fix what was broken, to keep going. I set it down careful, like placing a memory back where it belonged. Back in the house, Grandma was asleep, in her chair, the green yarn tangled in her lap. I covered her with a blanket, her breathing soft, and felt a quiet gratitude. She'd carried Dad's truth when I couldn't, and now she was here, part of this place again. I moved to the kitchen, where Mom's letter still sat, its words unread since yesterday. I picked it up, my fingers steady, and slid it into a drawer. I'd answer her someday, but not now. The need to explain myself was gone, replaced by a stillness I hadn't known I could hold. I stepped outside again, drawn to the garden bed Marjorie and I had cleared. The soil was dark, waiting. I pulled a small packet of seeds from my pocket, ones I'd found in Dad's journal, labeled in his careful hand, marigolds his favorite. I knelt, pressing each seed into the earth, my movements slow, deliberate. The act felt right, like a promise I wasn't making to anyone but myself. The yard was quiet, the neighborhood still, and I could almost hear Dad's voice, low and steady, telling me to keep it simple. When I finished, I stood brushing dirt from my hands. The tree at the edge of the yard caught my eye, its trunk solid, its leaves catching the last light. I walked to it, my fingers finding the spot where Dad had carved his initials as a boy, the lines faint but clear. I traced them, feeling the rough bark, and something settled in me. Not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance. The house was mine, not to prove anything, but because it was where I'd learned to stand. I turned back, the sky darkening, and let the quiet hold me whole and still. I woke before dawn, the house dark except for the faint glow of the porch light filtering through the curtains. My mornings had changed. No more lying in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for answers. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and started coffee, the machine's hum filling the quiet. The kitchen smelled of wood polish, now not dust, and the counters were clear, no more stacks of flyers or unpaid bills. I'd been paying them off one by one with what little I had left after Bernard's fees. It wasn't easy, but it was mine to do. I stepped outside, the air sharp, carrying the scent of frost. The garden bed was bare, the marigold seed still buried, waiting for spring. I walked the yard, my boots crunching on the gravel path Dad had laid years ago. Each step felt different now, not heavy, but grounded, like I was walking on my own terms. I stopped by the shed, its door closed tight, and thought of the workbench inside, the tools I'd started using again. I wasn't fixing the house for Dad anymore, but for me, for the life I was building here. Grandma was up when I came back, in her hands, wrapped around a mug, her eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft but clear, like she was seeing me for the first time in a while. "Got work to do," I said, pouring coffee. It wasn't just the house. I'd been sketching plans for a small woodworking shop, something to run out of the garage using Dad's tools. The idea had come late one night, flipping through his journal, seeing his notes on projects he'd never started. It felt right, like a way to keep his hands in mine. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Grandma sipped her coffee, her knitting needle still on the table. The green yarn coiled like a promise. I thought about Mom, her letter still in the drawer unanswered. I didn't hate her, didn't even blame her anymore. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. The ache was there, but it was quieter now, like a bruise fading under the skin. Marjorie stopped by later, her truck rattling into the driveway. She carried a bag of bulbs, tulips she said would bloom red come spring. "Thought the garden could use some color," she said, setting them down, her hands smudged with dirt. I nodded, grateful, and we worked together, planting them in neat rows. Her presence was easy, no pressure to talk, just the steady rhythm of digging and placing. I caught her eye once, and she smiled, small but real, and I felt something loosen in my chest, like I could breathe a little deeper. I stood up, brushing soil from my knees, and looked at the house, its windows catching the morning light. It wasn't perfect, cracks in the paint, a gutter that still sagged, but it was standing, and so was I. I turned to Marjorie, my hands still, and let the moment settle, quiet and full, like the first breath after a long climb. I sat on the porch steps, the wood cool under my hands, the afternoon light slanting across the yard. The house stood behind me, its walls solid, carrying the marks of Dad's work and mine. I'd spent the morning sanding a shelf for the garage, the first piece for the shop I was starting. The motion was slow, deliberate, the wood dust settling like fine snow. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about building something new, one step at a time. Grandma joined me, her cane tapping softly as she settled beside me. She didn't speak, just looked out at the street where kids rode bikes in lazy circles. I thought of Mom, her absence a quiet shadow, and realized I didn't need her to understand my choice. The house wasn't just a place. It was where I'd learned to stand, not for her, not for Dad, but for myself. That truth had come slow, carved out of silence, and small acts like planting seeds or sanding wood. I found a notebook in the garage later, One of Dad's its pages filled with sketches of furniture he'd wanted to build. I added my own, a simple table, my lines less sure but steady. It felt like a conversation, one we'd never finished in life. I closed the notebook, my fingers lingering on its cover, and knew I'd keep going not to prove anything, but because this was mine now. The yard was still, the tulip bulbs Marjorie planted hidden under the soil, waiting for their time. I looked at them, at the house, at the life I was shaping, and felt a quiet certainty. Loss hadn't broken me, it had shown me what I could carry. Not everything needs to be said or won or fixed. Sometimes it's enough to keep what's yours and let the rest fall away. What have you held on to even when it hurt to keep it? If this story hit something in you, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who might get it. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with another truth, quiet but real.